Okay. Hold on. Yes. Yeah. Me. For me. Yeah. Okay. Okay. All right. All right. Everybody can hear me online. Thanks so much, everybody, for joining us through Zoom. We are going to get started. I'm going to go ahead. I'm waving. I'm Sheree. I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Welcome. All right. Let's see. Okay. Someone ding their glass. So you ding your glass for me with a fork or something. Okay. I know. It's like, oh my gosh. Hi, everybody. How are you? Nice to see you all. Thank you so much for coming. And everybody wave at the camera to everybody that's on Zoom, that's over in that corner so they can see us, including our speaker. So, oh, and you can't even see me. So maybe I'll go like, right, where am I? All right, I'll go right here. All right. So welcome everybody to the Big Valley Beekeepers Guild meeting for April. We're so excited. We're going to have to find another spot. But we're so glad that you're here to support the restaurant too, because they do let us use this place for free at no charge. So, but they do ask everyone to order something. So we really appreciate it. And it's a great chance to have a good margarita, have some Mexican food. And all of you at home are missing out. So you need to be here next time if you can. So we're going to go through just a couple of notes and then we'll introduce our speaker. But first, some housekeeping. There is a restroom through the restaurant and kind of towards the back you're welcome to use. Did everybody sign in on the sign-in sheet? All right, excellent. Did everybody get a raffle ticket? All right, fantastic. We really, every month we do a raffle, and if you bring something to donate that's bee related or bee themed, you actually get an extra raffle ticket. So next month, be sure to bring something with you. So Lush, let's see. Let's get to our next staff here. And I might have to, hold on, let me click. Let's see. All right. Let's see if it'll do it. Oh, there we go. So for some news and updates, we are actively recruiting not only for another director on our board, but also a director in waiting. And it really doesn't involve too much. What it involves is getting together with your fellow board members and making some really great decisions and events come together throughout the year for our guild. So if that's something you're interested in, please let us know. Please talk to either myself or Paul. My name is Sheree Sintes Glover. I'm one of the board of directors, as well as Paul right there. Say hi, Paul. And we have Judy Frema. There we go. So you're welcome to talk to any of us about the opportunity. We do have some class and nuke updates. So those of you who were students in our beginning beekeepers class in February, we have finally set a date for the field day because the weather is now cooperating. So that will be April 29th. And we're going to be sending out an email probably tomorrow about that. So watch your email if you're in the class. And it will be at a property that's just maybe a mile or so east of Lodi. So we're really excited about it. And you'll need by then to have a suit, right? Or some kind of veil of some sort. And that's really it. And we're going to be doing it in the morning, probably from 9 to 12. So just have that on your calendar for now. Anything to add about that, Paul? Only it depends on how many respond with RCPs from the class. And if people do want to come, they have to be a member. Yeah. So great way to join and support the guild. All right. Yes. Sorry. I'm hoping within the next week or so. Yeah. Maybe it might be up to a few days just before, but we'll keep everybody posted on it too. Nuke updates. So as you probably know, if you don't know, what's kind of interesting is that the temperature, daytime temps have to be a certain height in order for the queens to mate. And so that's what our nukes that you got through the Big Valley Beekeepers Guild, that's what we're waiting for, is for those queens to get mated and for that nuke box to have all stages of brood, right? So we're hoping that they're going to be ready possibly the first weekend in May. So just be prepared. Look for your emails if you've ordered a nuke. because we definitely want you to be on alert for that, because you'll need to come and pick those up as well. So if you have any questions, please email us. But those nukes, again, we're hoping to be available the first weekend in May. We've already talked about our field day update. We may need a couple of volunteers to help on the field day, get people checked in, and the same thing for the nuke distribution. So if that's something you're interested in, please email us and let us know. Yes, Judy. Oh, thank you. There's a volunteer sign up sheet. So there you go. Before you leave, make sure you sign up there if you'd like to volunteer. Mentorship. So we have so many new beekeepers, and we have some wonderfully experienced beekeepers. And what we found is that a lot of us, especially on the board, we get so busy, not only with our own hives, but with our daily jobs. All of us work full time, and with our family and our life commitments. So a lot of times it's really hard for us to mentor outside of other times. I know for myself, I'm also the beekeeping leader for our 4-H/Grange youth project in beekeeping. And I do mentor when I can. But what we realized is that we really need to pair our new beekeepers that want to mentor with those that are willing to mentor. So just a quick show of hands, how many of you right now would really love to have a mentor to work with as you go through this first year? Oh my goodness. Okay. So here's what I want to challenge everyone here with, and even those of you online, is if you keep those hands raised for a second, keep raised. So before you leave the meeting tonight, please connect. If you're a beekeeper that has 2 or more years under your belt, connect with one of these people that has raised their hands and see if maybe that's something that you want to do, is be a mentor. And we'll kind of work on that this year and kind of see if we can pair people up, or maybe at least open those doors for everybody to get someone. Okay, great. All right. So some new announcements as well have to do with the operator ID and your ability to purchase varroa mite treatments in California. So last week, Judy and myself met with the San Joaquin County Ag Commissioner, and she was fantastic. She actually spent about 2 hours with us, kind of learning more about the hobbyists and what we face, and really what are some of our challenges. And we're going to have more information, more details as time goes on, but we just want to kind of explain a couple of things. One is that there's a difference between an OIN, which is operator ID number, and registering your hives at the county. We also realize that every county is different. So what you do in Stanislaus County versus San Joaquin versus Calaveras versus Amador versus Placer, it can all be different. And it really depends on your ag commissioner office. But at least we know in our area in San Joaquin County, which is our prime area, right now you can go in. It's super easy. I did it on Friday. Both Judy and I did. We went ahead and got our operator ID numbers. We fill out a form. We told her, hey, this is where our hives are. They didn't care about how many or anything like that. And it was free. But it gave me the form that I needed so that if I need to order from Man Lake, I can do that now. And what's happened, we also talked with Man Lake. Man Lake is now kind of a little bit under the microscope as far as Yolo County. And that's why now they're having to track on their end that they have and are asking for the paperwork needed by the state of California to buy those treatments. So again, we could literally spend a whole hour just on that topic, and we might just do that at another date. But for now, know that in San Joaquin County, you can set up an appointment. You can go in, get your operator ID number, and it's super easy. We were actually pretty happy. But that's what you're likely going to need. Yes, Judy. Oh, yes, yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh, yes. So for those on Zoom, what we said was that you have to do it every year. It's only good for 1 calendar year. So everyone's expires at the end of the year. And you have to go in person. So, but we'll have more details about that when it comes. Okay. Or you can talk to us with us after the meeting.
Does this replace the VFD?
Sorry.
Does this replace the veterinary form, the VFD?
Oh, hi, Brad. That I'm not sure. We would have to ask that. We have to find out. Yeah, good question. Okay.
It probably wouldn't.
It probably wouldn't. Well,
No,
and
that's a whole different regulation.
oh, got it.
So this
Okay.
is just to buy mite treatments?
This is just to buy a hive mite treatments in California. We have to. It's unfortunately, it's where we live. I know. So something else that came up was hive registration. And the reason why hive registration and why programs like Be Aware are so important. And again, we'll probably need to spend maybe a whole meeting just on these topics, probably sooner than later. But hive registration really does one thing. It allows you to be contacted if you're in an agricultural area and someone is going to spray something that could impact your bees. And they have to notify you within 48 hours, basically, or 48 hours prior to give you a chance to do something. And what you choose to do is really kind of up to you in the situation. But that's the difference between the operator ID number used to buy treatments versus the registration. So what's good is that you can get the operator ID number that you need to buy treatments without registering your hives. So just know that. And we'll have more information as that comes up. But there is a good reason to be registered if that's what you want to do. And it's because if you want to be notified to be given a heads up by, the agriculture community in your area about what's being sprayed, then, and basically give you time to do something with your bees. It allows that partnership between you and the farmer to basically collaborate on what you can do. So, and to register your hives, if you have 9 or less hives, it's actually waived any kind of a registration fee. So if you have 9 or less hives in our county, especially, they won't even collect any fee. The fee currently is $10. And right now the apiary board is considering raising that. So that's what the apiary board is kind of mulling over at the moment. So that was just a very, very quick high level overview, but we just wanted to give you more information as we kind of disseminate that through the Facebook group and through email and stuff. Okay. All right. So if you haven't already joined the Big Valley Beekeepers Guild for 2023, please do so. You can do it with Judy or myself or Paul at the end of the meeting. And if you have joined today, you get a special membership pin. So make sure you get that if you're a member for this year. Also, we still have t-shirts available. So I think everybody saw those as they came in. And if you'd ever like to sponsor one of our meetings and our Zoom meetings, it's only $20. So just let us know, and you can even do it online and through PayPal or credit card. All right, good deal. So with that, I want to introduce our guest speaker. So tonight's topic is swarm management, what's really happening in your hives. And our guest speaker is Stephen Repasky. And forgive me, we're going to have to let him. Stephen, how do you say your name again?
Stephen, just like you said. No, last name's Repasky.
Right, Repasky. Oh, so he is the author of Swarm Essentials. And if you haven't gotten his book already, it's one of the best reads you can get just about learning about swarm behavior. And after the meeting tonight, we have a link on where you can purchase his book. So we'll make sure to post that and share it. But really what we're going to do is we're going to find out what's really happening in our hives, and he's going to discuss the swarm process, right? And what you as a beekeeper should watch for in the hives leading up to swarming, and how to manage that colony after it's swarmed in order to keep it alive and thriving. So just a little bit about Stephen. Stephen is a second generational beekeeper. He's nationally recognized as a speaker and an author, and a consultant from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So he's like 3 hours ahead of us right now. So we're very fortunate that he's still up and awake with us. He's a certified master beekeeper through the Eastern Apicultural Society, and is the past president of the Pennsylvania State Beekeepers Association, past president and co-founder of Burgh Bees, and a former member of the board of directors of the American Beekeeping Federation. Stephen manages approximately 200 hives, mostly single brood chambers, and he does a presentation on that as well that we heard last year. And he manages those hives in Western Pennsylvania, is involved in honey production, queen rearing, and the sale of nukes, right, each spring and summer to those that are interested in starting out their beekeeping journey. He also manages the National Airport, where there are nearly 100 colonies used in honey production, research studies, and queen production. In that location, the Pittsburgh International Airport is home to the largest apiary program in the country, located entirely on an airport facility, right, or property. Stephen had his first book published by Nucleus Press in 2014 entitled Swarm Essentials, which is the one that you'll get to learn about. And it can be found teaching beekeeping classes like ours and workshops and across the United States, as well as in the Pittsburgh area. And he presents on lectures on a variety of beekeeping topics, and we are so very grateful to have him. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing and let Stephen tell us all about Swarm Essentials. All right.
Awesome.
Okay.
Very good. Can you guys hear me okay out there?
Oh, hold on.
Sure,
We're going to
sure can.
turn you up here. Oh, let's see.
All right.
All right, here we go.
Everybody
go
raise
for
their margaritas if you could hear me. Very awesome. I'm jealous. I haven't eaten since last night. I've been running nonstop. So have a drink or three for me for sure. All right. Let me, I apologize. I'm going to cough a lot and drink some Coke here because I have a dry throat. It's allergy season out here. We've got lots of pollen going and it's rough. I've been talking a lot here last couple of weeks. So let me, what am I doing here? Sharing my screen, I think. Maybe. There we go.
Is it working? Yeah.
I'm getting there. There we go.
Oh, there we go.
Does
Perfect.
that work? Awesome. Okay. Perfect. Those of you that are online with the chat, feel free to type your questions in and I'll answer them at the end. It just kind of gets a little bit crazy trying to look at both things. So we'll answer all the questions at the end. That won't be a problem. A lot of information going on tonight. And first and foremost, again, thank you for the invitation back. It's nice to see fellow beekeepers on the left side of the country here. And yes, it is past my bedtime. It's whatever time here, 9 something. I don't even know anymore, but that's okay. So we're going to cover a lot of information about swarms tonight, and not so much about the actual capture of swarms, but more about what's happening in the hive, because as beekeepers, we tend to focus on the things that kind of get us excited, right? The swarms that are hanging in the tree and where's the queen and things like that. But as beekeepers, we tend to forget about the rest of the colony and how those things, excuse me, how those things going on in the hive affect how we manage our bees. So first and foremost, what is swarming? Right? Swarming is basically your natural asexual means of reproducing at a colony level. We know that the queen lays eggs, it turns into larvae and pupa and pre-pupa, and then emerge as adults. That's kind of your cellular level. But then we talk about the asexual, larger producing side of bees, which is swarming. And typically that occurs in early to mid-spring, which coincides with our peak nectar flows. Now, of course, you've heard already that beekeeping is not black and white. There's large gray areas. And Mother Nature follows just in suit. Just here in the last 3 days, we have been reaching in the mid 80s, and typically we should be in the 60s at this time of year in April. So everything is out and about. We've actually had swarms already here in Western Pennsylvania, and typically our first swarms don't really come until the 1st of May. So we're all out of whack out here, and we'll get into that and talk about that in a little bit. But ultimately, the role of swarming historically was just large-scale reproduction, right? That's how bees spread their genetics and went across the landscape. Well, starting back in 1987, when the varroa mites showed up, we started to realize that the swarming, not only is it a reproductive stage, it's also helping break the brood cycle of the bees, which in turn breaks the reproductive cycle of the mites themselves. And of course, then you talk about beekeeper education, right? Not only from our standpoint as beekeepers, but also the non-beekeeping public and what swarms are and what they mean and why they're actually not dangerous. Excuse me. So as far as timing and frequency, latitude has a lot to do with it. Drone production has a lot to do with it. Resources abundance has a lot to do with it. And even the time of day has an influence on swarming behavior. And the graph that you're looking at there is a graph that I have in my book. And basically it shows you the top graph, the blue line shows the production of drones within a colony versus the production of queens in a colony. Excuse me, I apologize. This is really bad allergy season for me, and I normally don't have an issue, but this weather's really messing things up. So when it comes to drone production versus queen production, we see a large growth in colony numbers as far as drones are concerned prior to the actual production of queens in a colony. And if you were to go into your colonies now, you would probably see drone production. I think you guys are probably getting into that swarm season now. I've got some friends in Sonoma Valley or Sonoma County, and they've got swarms already, and you guys are probably getting close to that, if not have already started. But leading up to that production of queen cells, you'll see this spike in drones. And that's a good indicator that we want to pay attention to as we get into our hives and inspect them. Well, then fast forward, we see the queen cell production. And the reason there's a delay there is that when you look at the production of drones and their biology, it takes 24 days for them to mature from egg to adults, and then another 10 to 14 days to mature to become sexually mature. And at that same time, queens take 16 days to emerge as an adult, and then another 7 to 10 days to mature. So when those two time frames overlap, you end up with a large amount of sexually mature drones ready to seek out those sexually mature virgin queens. And that's what we want in order to succeed as far as swarm production and the spreading of genetics. So as we talked about, latitude has a lot to do with it. You know, we see these swarms earlier in the south, later in the north. Louisiana started long ago, end of February, early March. Here we are in Pennsylvania and to New York in the northeastern part of the United States. We're starting to get swarms, and you'll see the same thing on the West Coast too, where obviously in San Diego, it's like perfect weather 99.999% of the time, and they have almost a year-round type of a nectar flow, and they can have swarms pretty much every month of the year. But as you go farther north into California and you get even up in eastern into the mountain ranges, that all can impact. And at the base of the mountains, you could be 3-4 weeks below the beekeepers that are up higher on the slopes. So you have to take all that type of stuff into consideration when you're looking at the biology of the hive itself and how that impacts your development of the swarm impulse. As we talked about, drone production is an indicator. It typically starts about 4 to 6 weeks prior to the start of your swarm season. And even using environmental signs as an indicator. So here in the East, we use dandelions as our indicator, because when dandelions are blooming all over the place, that's usually a good indicator that we're about 2 weeks away from the start of swarm season. And of course, each of these phenological indicators, as we call them, each of these types of plants that are blooming are going to vary region to region, state to state, and even local to local areas. Everybody uses their own thing, but typically here in the Northeast, we use dandelions. You know, down in the South, they might be using pepperbush. So it varies, and that's something you would have to kind of learn from your local beekeepers, what kind of environmental indicators you're going to be looking for. And of course, the frequency of swarming is also dependent on abundance of resources, right? The more honey we have, the more, I shouldn't say honey, the more nectar that's available, the more pollen that's available, ultimately results in more brood production, which then lends itself to giving that colony a greater ability to swarm multiple times. Colonies don't swarm once and then be done. They could swarm 2, 3, 4 times depending on the colony. And of course, genetics play a role in that as well. And of course, we also have to take into consideration colony equilibrium. And we'll talk about this more later on in the talk tonight. But that colony equilibrium is offset when you produce a number of queens, which happens during swarm season. And when you have too many queens available, you have to get back to that equilibrium. And we'll explain why that's important a little bit later. And of course, all these other influences on swarming, right? Pheromone dilution. So the queen mandibular pheromone is that pheromone that keeps the hive together, so to speak, and it tells the workers that all is well and they can go out and forage and do this and take care of the brood and whatever they need to do. But when you get too many bees in the colony, that pheromone is diluted. And then that triggers a response to the bees and saying, hey, we're not getting as much pheromone as we want. What's going on here? We need to do something. Then, of course, all the other variables fall into place too, like a lack of space, meaning they don't have enough room to lay brood up, and they don't have enough room to store the nectar. They also take into effect crowding, which is different than lack of space. So crowding is more of a population type of a dynamic versus lack of space is a nectar storage and reproductive type of a dynamic. And of course, resource abundance, right? If you have lots of resources available, they're going to bring in more nectar and pollen, they're going to raise more brood, and all these other variables come into play. But we may also have years where it's really wet and cold or really dry, and your resource abundance is really low. So your swarming behavior can also be impacted by that. Genetics, as we talked about, play a role. Russian bees are notorious for swarming more times in smaller amounts than the Italians, which might swarm once or twice, but they swarm with lots of bees compared to the Russians. So genetics have an influence here. Environmental conditions, is it hot and warm? Is it cold? Is it snow, rain, all those types of things? And even the age of queen can impact how a colony swarms and when. So this little graph here was put out by Dr. Christina Grosinger out of Penn State, and it shows you just how complex the swarm process is. We have a lot of changes in colony condition in the upper left, a decrease in brood production, engorging of the workers as they fill their honey stomachs up with honey before they leave, mass queen rearing, rapid population growth, combined with the non-chemical signals in that blue, dark blue or black, where they're getting ready to leave, so they're doing waggle dancing for potential nest sites. You're going to have piping of workers and queens as they communicate, and then boom, they take off and they fly off and they land in a temporary resting spot. And at that point, you have queen pheromones that play a huge role. And I mentioned that queen mandibular pheromone that keeps the colony together within the colony itself, the hive itself. It also does the same when a colony swarms, and the queen doesn't necessarily lead the swarm. She's mixed in the middle there somewhere, but her pheromone keeps the bees together in this large, chaotic ball of bees in the air. And then, of course, when they land and then take off and find a new home and do their thing. So it's a very complex behavior, but it's also very fascinating, but it also gives us a lot of headaches if we're not paying attention. But not all colonies are going to swarm as well, right? So this lack of productivity, colonies that exist and might survive year to year, but don't really produce, they don't swarm, and they're not necessarily sick, but they're not healthy. They survive, but it's not the survival of the fittest. And this is some of the things we have to pay attention to in our colonies that we have, that we may have that favorite colony that every year survives, but you may also notice, wow, my queen doesn't swarm. They just kind of exist. They don't produce a lot of honey. Those aren't, it's great for keeping our morale up because our bees aren't dying, but it's also not giving us a very nice, healthy genetic to make more honey and to produce more bees and do things along those lines. Now, as we get into the swarming, I break swarming down into 3 different stages. The first stage is what we call pre-swarming stage. This is typically where we talk about swarm prevention, all these different techniques about splitting and reversing hive bodies. And we'll get into this just a little bit, but it's that stage that leads up to what we call active swarming. And I call it the stage of denial, right? Those aren't my bees that are 60 feet in the tree. My bees don't swarm. I took care of them. I checked them 3 weeks ago, or I fed them and they didn't swarm. And we have all these excuses of why they're not our bees. And the reality of it is they probably are your bees. You're just not recognizing the signs. That's a very short stage. And then, of course, we move right into post-swarming. And this is what I call the management stage. How do we get back to equilibrium? How do we manage that colony that swarmed and make sure that we have a queen that is producing and doing what she needs to do so that that colony can continue to thrive throughout the rest of the year, through the winter and into the spring? So let's talk about pre-swarming, right? This is the prevention stage. It's also the longest stage of the 3 stages, and timing is very critical when we talk about swarm prevention. And prevention is not even really a good word. It's more mitigation, right? Because it's very rare that you're actually going to prevent a swarm. You may think you're preventing it, but ultimately they're going to do what they want to do anyhow. But it means that a few days that you miss or get to them in time can be a successful prevention, or it can be an exercise in futility, where you do all these different things because you looked at it on YouTube and then they swarm anyway. And we've all been there. And if you haven't been there, you're going to be there, because we've all done it, where no matter what we do, the bees swarm regardless. This is a 4 to 6 week time period. It typically starts, like I said, 4 to 6 weeks prior to the first swarm, but no later than when that first viable queen cell appears. So we might have queen cups here and there, and that means we're getting close. But as soon as that first queen cup has an egg laid in it, it now becomes a viable queen cell. And now we move from the prevention stage into that active swarming stage. So up until that point, we have lots of time to manipulate and manage our colonies. But of course, prevention isn't a required management skill, and it's not an absolute management skill. So those of you that are just starting beekeeping thinking, oh my God, I got to learn all about this prevention, don't sweat it. Everybody's bees are going to swarm. Eventually you'll get your head wrapped around this whole idea of prevention, and you'll figure out ways that you could actually make it work in your own bee yard. Lots of schools of thought, lots of different techniques on prevention. Find one that's going to work, find 5 or 6 that are going to work, and practice them if you so choose. But there's also some important things that we need to consider when we talk about swarm prevention in this pre-swarming stage, right? What time of the year are your plants blooming in your area, right? Certain trees, whether it's mesquite or whether it's some of the early wildflowers or whatever it is in your neck of the woods, understand when those types of blooms actually start producing nectar and pollen, because that's going to help you make decisions when it comes to prevention or active swarming or the management after the fact. Know your historic swarming dates, right? Like here in Western Pennsylvania, historically, and on average, we're probably looking around May 1st for our swarm dates. This year is not average. It's not normal. We're looking at swarms 2-3 weeks ahead of schedule. Bees are going nuts. And then, of course, Monday and Tuesday of this week, we are in highs of 45. And then we get into the 50s and then eventually the 60s by the end of the week. And that's going to really screw things up too. But at least know the average swarm date so that you could start to adjust accordingly. And of course, probably even, I don't want to say more important, but just as important are the internal hive observations. What do you see in those colonies? This little structure here means something. What are we calling it? Is it a play cup? Is it a queen cup? Is it an actual queen cell that has an egg in it? Those are the things that we have to observe and pay attention to. So oftentimes we're late when it comes to preventing a swarm because we react rather than become proactive and stay ahead of things. And it's almost impossible to stay ahead of the bees. Oftentimes we think that we're early on something, and it usually means that we're on time. So we react to seeing those swarm cells and we cut them off rather than taking actions in the weeks ahead to try to minimize them. So when it comes to prevention, you have to begin that management about 4 weeks prior to the average date of your first swarms, or when whatever that plant is in your area that blooms. So we use dandelions because when dandelions bloom, that tells me I'm about 2 weeks out from my swarm season. Now, even this year, as goofy as it is, our dandelions started blooming about 2 weeks, but they're really bloomed in earnest within the last few days. But of course, our swarms overlap that. So there's always some variation. Even things like purple-eyed drones, which is that stage of drone development where they're in the pupal stage. They're all white except for the dark eyes, which are either brown or purple. And that tells us they're about 12 to 14 days old. We have another 12 to 14 days before they emerge, and then probably another 10 to 12 days before they're sexually mature. So when I see purple-eyed drones, that tells me I can make splits. That also tells me I better start watching out for queen cells in the next 2 to 4 weeks. And then even forsythia, if you guys have those out there, those big yellow, they have the bushes that bloom with yellow flowers before the leaves come out. when they bloom here in the east, that's a good indicator that we have drones in the colonies. So we don't even have to go into our colonies to note that this is happening. We could just look at the different plants that are blooming at those particular times to help us make some management decisions. So when it comes to prevention, there's all these different techniques, as I mentioned: reversing hive bodies, artificial swarms, queens, adding supers, cutting cells out, clipping wings. We're not going to talk about any of that because that's another 5 topics in and of itself. But the important thing is to know there's a lot of different variations out there. None of them are wrong. None of them may be perfect for you, but I'm sure you'll find something that's going to work. And probably the one thing that you want to take from this slide is utilizing usable space when it comes to preventative techniques. And usable space is basically comparing drawn comb to undrawn foundation. And I often hear beekeepers say, I went into my colony and they were crowded, so I gave them more space and I threw a super full of undrawn foundation on them. That's not usable space. That is foundation that has the potential to become usable space. The drawn comb is why it's worth its weight in gold, because drawn comb is utilized immediately. And the analogy that I often use is if I have at my house, my in-laws want to move in with me, so I need to build an addition. And I build the addition, but I don't put in a bed, I don't put in the kitchen, I don't put in a bathroom. It's space, but where are my in-laws going to be? Where I don't want them, in my space. So I have to put in the couch and the bed and the TV and the kitchen and the bathroom so that it's usable and they stay out of my space, and we have that space to get along just fine. So the bees do the same thing. They need usable space versus unusable space, and how you apply that space is crucial when it comes to prevention. So as we come out of prevention, we move into the active swarming stage. And this is the stage that I call mitigation, right? We're running around, we're trying to figure out what's happening. We're trying to mitigate the damage, if you will, as to what just happened. And basically this active swarm period is a situation where you have queen cells of all ages, and you may or may not know if that colony swarmed. So you might have open queen cells, capped queen cells. You can't find the queen. There's bees everywhere. Now we have to do something, or at least we feel we have to do something. And this is where we quickly react and cut off queen cells and make splits. And we don't know why we're doing it, because we're just doing it because we were told that's what we should do. And it doesn't mean that we're necessarily doing the right thing. We have to get into that hive and figure out what exactly is happening. This is also a very small window of opportunity. And we'll talk about that here in the next slides as to why it's so small of a window. And of course, the easy thing is seeing that swarm on a clustering on a branch, right? We show up into a bee yard. Oh, wow, look, there's a swarm. Not mine. I'll catch them anyways, and I put them in. They are going to be yours. And the more important thing is to understand what's going on inside of that hive. So before you do anything, before you act, before you start making splits and running around like a chicken with its head cut off, you need to do some investigating. You need to figure out what exactly is happening, what colony that swarm came from, and what can you do about it? Now, I'll back up and say, certainly catch the swarm first, because we don't want them flying away. They're free bees, so to speak. But don't fall into that trap of saying, well, it's not my bees that swarm because I was just in there 2 weeks ago. A lot can happen in a very short time frame, and I'll explain why. So first and foremost, after you catch the swarm, or prior to the swarm actually happening, you want to observe the behavior that's happening within your bees or the bee yard. So looking at the activity of the hive, is there a lack of foraging? Are you seeing that crowded condition during optimum foraging time? And this picture here is a perfect example of that. We would typically just call that bearding, which is true. It is what that is, but it's not bearding that we think of when it comes to high humidity, high temperatures later in the summer where bees are just hot. This is a condition where there's so many bees in that hive, they can't all fit. And typically during swarm season, temperatures are on the cooler side for the most part, especially at night, and then it warms up during the day, etc. But most importantly is the observation of these bees that are hanging out during that optimum foraging time, which is between 9:30, 10 o'clock in the morning and about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. If you see a lot of bees on your front of your hive during that prime foraging time, you probably have some swarm behaviors happening within the colony. If you happen to miss that, you're going to have the issuing of the swarm. The bees are going to take off. You see this rapid, disorganized flight, that distinctive hum in the air, which everybody kind of panics about. But then when you think back on it, you're like, wow, that's a pretty cool sound. You sit back and listen to it. So they leave the hive. They will rest on a temporary resting spot called a bivouac, which could be a tree, it could be a plane, it could be a car. I've caught them on all of those and then some. While they're there, they send out scouts to look for a new location for them to set up their home. It might be a swarm trap, or it could be your neighbor's house. And then ultimately they move in, they establish themselves, and now we have a complete swarm cycle that has taken place. But we also don't want to confuse those activities with some of these other activities that we might see in the bee yard. One being orientation flights. Orientation flights are typically later in the afternoon. You see this distinct flight pattern up and down, left and right, very close to the hive, and it occurs later in the day. Compare that to robbing, where you have frantic flights all over the hive. Bees are fighting at the entrance. There's more bees trying to get in than they are coming out. And a lot of time that robbing behavior will happen during a nectar dearth. So typically in the middle of the summer in most locations. And then, of course, that bearding that we just talked about, right? This bearding that's in late summer, it usually occurs late in the day and the early evening. And by morning, it relieves itself because it's been cooler. The bees come back in, or they take off to do their foraging activities over the course of the day. Versus that swarming bearding that occurs is during the middle of the day. This overheating type of bearding occurs late in the day. So we open up the hive. And lo and behold, this is what we find, right? Our classic swarm cells, these elongated, well-developed cells. And in this case, they're not capped off yet. They're still in the early stage, but we see swarm cells, and they're typically found on the lower third of a frame. If anybody runs top bars, you'll find them on the outer edges of the brood nest. But it's a classic sign that, hey, my colony is going to be getting ready to go. So using our observations in the hive, doing that investigation before we act is going to help us determine what we want to do and how we want to do it. So estimating the swarm development is a lot based on the evidence that you observe. How old are the queen cells? And we're going to show you how to age those queen cells. Where are they putting that new wax? Is it on the frames? Is it on the top bars? What do your brood patterns look like? Is there a lot of open brood? Is there no brood at all? And of course, nectar storage too. Where are they putting that nectar? Is it being backfilled into the brood nest? If so, what does that mean? Or maybe it's all going in the supers, which is what we want when it comes to honey harvesting. Now, there's several key elements that we want to talk about when we're looking at these observations. One is the type of queen cells, because not all queen cells are created equal. We also want to look at the age of queen cells, right? So queen cells, we know, take 16 days to go from egg until fully adult queen that emerges from her cell. We also know that those queen cells are typically capped at approximately day 8. We also know that the primary swarm, which is the first swarm that leaves from the colony, will take off the day of or the day before those swarms, the very first swarm cells are capped. Now, keep in mind, you could have 10 or 12 swarm cells. It's those first ones that get capped are the ones that trigger that very first swarm. And of course, this is weather dependent. So they may cap a cell and it could rain for 3 days, and you may go in and still find that queen, but ultimately she's going to leave as soon as the weather allows her to. How many of those queen cells are present and what stage they're in will dictate how many secondary swarms you have. And this is swarm number 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever it may be. Those secondary swarms are going to contain one or more virgin queens, and they typically are going to leave the colony within a day or two shortly after the virgin queens emerge. So when we look at the math on all that, what that tells us is these secondary swarms are going to happen 8 to 14 days after the primary swarm. Because if the first couple cells are capped at day 8 and the primary swarm takes off, we still have 8 more days for those queens the virgin queens to emerge. So your first secondary swarm can happen 8, 9, 10 days, upwards of 14 days later, again, depending on how many cells are open, how old they are, etc. And this is also where I get the comments from beekeepers where they catch a couple of swarms in their yards, and they say, well, I caught one last week, so this one I caught can't be mine because I already caught one. What they're actually experiencing is the first swarm and then the secondary swarms 8, 10, 12, 14 days a little bit later. So we have to understand how that math works within the colony itself. Now, as I mentioned, the type of queen cells are very important, and because not all queen cells are created equal, your type of queen cell is going to give you information on the health of the colony itself. So when you see queen cups, do they mean anything? And typically queen cups is just a structure that you could find any time of the year for the most part. But as soon as it lays an egg in that queen cup, that means that that queen cup now becomes a queen cell. And are they viable? Is there a queen in your hive? How do you know? These are all questions you want to ask yourself. So this is that structure, right? We may call it a play cup, a queen cup, but ultimately when we tilt it on its side and open it up, lo and behold, we find an egg, right? Now, knowing biology is very important in beekeeping, and you're going to hear people tell you that how you have to know biology, you have to understand the bee biology in order to make management work, and this is where it comes into play. So we know that when a queen lays an egg, it stays an egg for 3 days and then hatches into a larvae. We also know that when a queen lays an egg, it starts up at a vertical position. At day 2, it lays over at a 45-degree position. Day 3, it lays over flat and then hatches into a larvae. So looking at this picture, it's difficult to tell because of the angle, but this is about a 2.5-day-old egg, which ultimately means within 12 hours or so, it'll hatch into a larvae. That also tells us from the previous slide, knowing that a queen cell is capped at roughly day 8, and we know that this queen cell, even though it's young with an egg, is approximately 3 days old. That tells us that we have 5 days to make some type of management decision when it comes to prevention of a swarm, whether we cut the queen cells out, whether we smash them, or whether we decide to make splits. This is that very short active swarm period. So when I talked about the active swarm period being short, this is why, because our queen cells get capped at day 8, the first swarm takes off at that same time, and now we have all these other stages of queen cells that kind of narrow our stage to do anything, or frame to do anything, shorter and shorter and shorter. Now we might look at a queen cell that's much older, it's elongated, they're building up the walls. That larvae is big and fat, sitting in a bed of royal jelly. It's not capped yet, so it tells us it's not 8 days old. It's probably more like 6 days old, which ultimately means that we have about 2 days to do some type of management prevention if we don't want this colony to swarm. Excuse me. And then we look at the capped queen cells, right? Fully capped, that means that it's at least at day 8. But knowing the biology and understand how certain characteristics come through, we could, again, tell you how old these queen cells are. So if you look at the cell on the right, the top one here on the upper right, you'll notice the tip of it looks very different from the queen cell here on the left. And what that means, it's an indicator of age, that as that queen cell gets closer to the 16-day mark, the workers will chew away that wax and expose the cocoon in the cell itself. And that's what we call a ripe queen cell. And it typically occurs at day 15. The queen emerges as an adult at day 16. At day 15, the caps are exposed. So when you look at this queen cell on the left, two things that we're able to determine from this picture. One, we lost our primary swarm already. They took off because it's a capped queen cell. We also know that that queen hasn't emerged yet because it's not open. So we could tell that that queen cell on the left is between 8 and 14 days old. The queen cell on the upper right here has that exposed tip. So that tells us that it's 15 days old, and probably within the next 12 to 24 hours, we're going to have a virgin queen emerge. And if you look right down below, you could see these caps that where the queen has already chewed her way out of the cell. And this is a better picture of that, where the caps are kind of hanging down, the queen has emerged, and she's out and doing whatever she does. Now, that also tells us something is, one, we already lost our primary swarm, and now because you have the queen cells that are emerging, we've also likely lost a secondary swarm. But the good news is we have queens running around in the colony somewhere, so it's not a complete loss just yet. We might also see this aborted queen cell where a emerged queen comes along to a queen cell, and it's her sister queen that's in there. So she chews a tiny hole in the side to sting the sister queen to death. Once she's dead, the workers will enlarge that opening to pull out the dead queen. And this is what we see in appearance. And this tells us something as well. It tells us that there's a queen in the colony somewhere. We may not know if she's mated or not, but at least we know that a queen has successfully emerged from the cells that she was raised in. Now, the time of year is also less important than the type and age of the queen cell. So the type of queen cell, whether it's a supersedure, emergency, or swarm, is important, as is the age. The time of year is less important because we could find queen cells pretty much any time of the year, depending on the colony's condition at that time. So swarm cells are the most common, right? This is what we know. This is what we're talking about today. Your classic long peanut-shaped type of a cell. This is what we call a planned event. So there's a lot of royal jelly. There's a lot of queen cells. They're typically on the lower third of the frame. And we see them everywhere this time of year when we get into swarm season. But we might also see the emergency queen cells, which are not a planned event. So it's reactionary, where the queen has accidentally been killed somehow, and they will take the youngest larvae they can find, and they'll raise queens from them. So here we have a frame from another beekeeper. This was right in the middle of May. So we're in the middle of swarm season in Pennsylvania. And the beekeeper called to tell me that their colony had swarmed and they needed a queen because they weren't seeing any brood. So they're walking me through everything, and it just didn't quite sound right. So I was only a short distance away, and I went over, and we're going through the colonies, and here's what we found. We see this nice frame of cat brood. In the middle, there's absolutely nothing. No eggs, no larvae. The brood is all emerging, which tells me this is the oldest brood on the frame. And the youngest brood, the eggs and larvae, were at one point on the outside. Well, we also know that the bees, when they raise queens, they search out the youngest larvae they could find. And then they start to feed it royal jelly. And so what we have here is all these short, fat emergency queen cells are on the outside edge. Backing up a few slides, some of the things that we learned is the age of those queen cells. So they're capped, so we know they're at least 8 days old. We also, if you look closely, none of them have that exposed tip. So they're not 15 days old. So they're between 8 and 14 days old. Well, the more we looked, and luckily the beekeeper kept notes, turns out that beekeeper was in this colony 12 days ago and accidentally crushed their queen. And so here we had a colony that was in the middle of swarm season, who probably would have swarmed, but in turn, because the queen was killed, it was set back, and now we have emergency cells to deal with. Again, it was in the middle of swarm season. Another picture of a different frame. This was from a nuke that I had. I intentionally removed the queen from this colony, and sure enough, you could see on the outside edges of the brood where it was youngest, there's a queen cell there along the bottom, 2 on the side. There's a couple up here on the top. And you might, look at this and go, oh, they're on the lower third of the frame. That is true. But if you look at the greater picture, you could see these queen cells that are all over the place, and they're short, which is an indicator of an emergency situation. So again, this is a colony that was going strong. I chose to remove the queen, and we turned them into an emergency situation. Not to be confused with supersedure. The supersedure cells are also a planned event, but they're typically found in less numbers than the swarm cells, and they're going to be found on the upper 2/3 of the frame. It's a situation where the queen is failing, the bees recognize this, and they start to raise a new queen. This colony also was in the middle of swarm season, but the queen wasn't doing very well. Excuse me. So instead of swarming, they were in the process of requeening and getting back on track. So again, time of year isn't as important as the type of queen cell and how old that queen cell is. Now, of course, we also have to pay attention to those sneaky queen cells, right? Because bees do things that we don't expect because they don't read the books that we write for them. And we get things like this. So on the upper left, this is a top bar of the frame. And according to what we're told, right, anything in the upper 2/3 of that frame is going to be a supersedure cell. Yep, it's long, it's big, it's fat, it's a planned event. However, when you look at the greater picture, and you can't see that in this slide, this frame was directly beneath a frame above it. So it was a double deep system. That frame right above it had 5 queen cells all along the lower 1/3 of the frame. They just happened to take this one queen cell and drop it over the edge to the frame directly below it. So as a standalone, it might look like a supersedure, but in the greater scheme of things, it was part of all the swarm situation that was going in there. This picture down below, hold on, I got technical. There we go. This picture on the lower left, these are emergency cells, but look how well they blend in. I mean, you could very easily miss those if there were bees covering it. Looking on the picture here on the right, these are both the same frames. The lower picture, there's 2 queen cells, one right here. If you can see my mouse, there's another picture or another queen cell right there. And about a week later, here's those swarm cells again, or I'm sorry, those queen cells. This is the emergency situation, but they emerged, and it's very difficult to tell just because of the way the frame is. So you have to be very careful about how bees kind of hide their queen cells and blend them in. They're very easy to miss if you're using that for any type of a management. So let's talk about colony equilibrium. And you heard me to mention this way back in the beginning of the talk. And colony equilibrium is basically a colony that has 1 queen, many workers, and numerous drones. This equilibrium is thrown off by the production of multiple queens in the case of swarming. And in order to get back to colony equilibrium, we have to have queen elimination taking place. Excuse me. So there's 4 mechanisms of elimination after the primary swarm. So you're in a swarm mode. Half the colony takes off with the first queen, and now we have all these extra queen cells, and we have to do something, or the bees have to do something. So one of those mechanisms is queen on queen elimination, which is where the 2 virgin queens or many virgin queens will fight each other to the death. This typically occurs outside of the original colony and inside the new location of whatever that colony may take up residence in, whether it's a hollow tree, your neighbor's house, or a box that you put them in after you caught them. But it's when the virgin queens fight against each other, and the winner is the one that takes over. You might also have pre-emergence destruction, where a virgin queen emerges first. She seeks out her sister queens within the cell and stings them to death. You will see that in the original colony. You also have secondary swarm departure, where you have multiple queen cells that emerge at once. The secondary swarm takes off, and you might have 2, 3, 4, 5 virgin queens in a colony. Have had as many as 12 in a colony, and I've had other beekeepers tell me they've caught 20 plus in a colony. So secondary swarm departure helps get you back to colony equilibrium. And then, of course, you have what's called the balling of unwanted virgin queens, where they seek out the queen pheromone profile that they are most attracted to. So if you have 6 queens in a swarm, they might pick 2 or 3 that they're most attracted to, and the other 3 are going to get balled and killed. And oftentimes beekeepers will see this when you're out collecting swarms. You might get to a swarm and you might find 1 or 2 balls of bees on the ground. And as you tease those bees apart, you notice there's a virgin queen. And you immediately think, wow, the queen fell out. I got to catch her and put her back in. You're not doing yourself any favors or the colony any favors, because you're putting a subpar queen back into that, and they'll eventually kill her again anyhow. So if you see queens like that, you could certainly catch them and use them to make splits with other colonies, but combining them back into that specific swarm, they're more than likely going to kill them. Now, most of this stuff all happens at once, right? You could have queen on queen elimination from a colony that just landed. back home, there's pre-emergence destruction taking place while there's a secondary swarm taking off. And then in the meantime, these queens are being balled and overheated and killed because their pheromone profile isn't acceptable. So as we come out of active swarm mode, that very short window, we move into post-swarming, which is, again, a longer window. And this is where we have to manage our colonies. And again, before we do anything, we want to evaluate. You want to observe. Look at the brood. What does it look like? What kind of condition is it in? And typically, if a colony has swarmed, it's going to be in the late stages of development. So you're not going to see many eggs and larvae, but you might see older larvae and capped brood or emerging brood. You're going to see the backfilling of brood with nectar, or the brood area with nectar. You're going to find queen cells that might be sealed, emerged, aborted. You might see some virgin queens running around. And ultimately, what it boils down to is you have to understand that the equilibrium of that colony takes time, right? We have to let the bees be bees and get back to that colony equilibrium. And the two things that beekeepers are is, one, we're impatient, and two, we're cheap. So we don't want to buy a queen and we don't want to wait for that queen. So we have to try to figure out something to do. Ultimately, we have to pick one of those. We have to either spend the money or wait. And this is typically what we have to do when it comes to getting back to colony equilibrium. So if I go out and I buy a queen right away that's mated, I may only have to wait a few days before she starts laying and my colony is back to equilibrium. If I let that colony requeen themselves from a recently capped queen cell, it might be upwards of a month or more before I see eggs from that newly mated queen. So we have to let colony equilibrium take place. And this is oftentimes where I get beekeepers that call me and also say, hey, my colony swarmed. It's been a week. I'm not seeing eggs. I want to buy a queen. This is why we have to be patient when it comes to that. So when we get into our colonies, we could take a look and observe, and using simple math, we could determine how long ago they swarmed. So we know how long we are into that colony equilibrium. We know that the development time from an egg and larvae to capping is roughly 8 days. We also know that it takes 21 days for worker brood to develop, takes 16 days for a queen, 24 days for drones. We know about the mating biology. We can narrow all this down to figure out what happened. So as I mentioned, this is in my book, the open brood present. So if you see eggs and larvae, chances are that colony swarmed very recently within a few days. Maybe you see no open brood, but you're seeing cap brood. That tells you that they swarmed maybe 4, 5, 6 days ago. Or maybe there's no brood at all and everything has emerged, but you see the remnants of a queen cell. Well, 21 days for workers to emerge and there's no eggs yet. So they swarmed over 3 weeks ago, and you may or may not have a new queen that started laying. And of course, worst case scenario, you don't have a queen and they turn into laying workers. And this is what it would look like, right? So what do those frames look like? Here we have a frame that has a lot of fresh nectar that's in the middle of the frame where we should normally see eggs and brood, larvae. We see that ring of cap brood that's emerging. And basically what that tells me is that that colony has swarmed probably 2 to 3 weeks ago, because I have a lot of nectar in the middle and my last remnants of the brood is finally emerging. Here's another frame, very similar, right? They're bringing nectar into the middle of that frame. I have the older brood emerging, but if I use my power of observation, lo and behold, on the right side in the middle there is my virgin queen, or maybe she's mated. She's not showing me any eggs yet, but at least I know I have a queen in there. So I have to be a little bit more patient to allow that colony equilibrium to take place. And then I have a laying queen that's doing what we're doing, excuse me, what she's doing. Worst case scenario, it all fails and you have a laying worker situation. In this case, not only is there no original brood left behind, we're seeing capped brood from the laying workers, which tells me that we're well into 4 or 5 weeks, possibly even 6 weeks time since that colony swarmed. And this is a classic case of what I call PPB, which is piss poor beekeeping, meaning that the beekeeper hasn't gone in and checked on that colony, kind of forgot about it, got busy with life, and then said, oh, I should probably go check and maybe I have a queen. And they don't. It happens to everybody. So don't feel bad. We all exhibit that that type of behavior in beekeeping. But once in a while, it just gets too busy. Another colony here, a very full frame of bees, lots of white wax on that top bar, lots of white wax on the nectar, queen cells along the bottom. Don't automatically assume that this colony has swarmed. It's tough to tell, but all those queen cells are capped. The story behind this was it was a very special queen that we had. She was marked. I opened this colony up. I saw those queen cells. I thought, crap, I lost the colony or the queen to a swarm. I looked around, didn't see a swarm anywhere, started going through all the frames. I went through this colony 3 separate times until I found her. She was marked, so I hadn't lost her just yet to a swarm. I made a split with her. I came back about 2 weeks later. This colony had actually requeened itself. There was a queen running around. The colony that had the special queen and I made the split off of went nuts in the nuke and ended up swarming anyways, again, very quickly, and I lost her anyway. So stuff happens. Bees do what they want to do despite it. But the point is, even in a colony that's very strong with capped queen cells, sometimes you get lucky and you're able to make a split and catch that swarm before it actually happens. This is a nice little yes or no chart that kind of goes how you should check a hive and how often during swarm season. It's a little out of blurry focus because for $25 you can buy the clean version in my book. So make sure you click on the link at the end and order your clean copy so you can have that to go out into the field. So ultimately, our colony swarms. Now what do we do, right? The panic is over. We caught the swarm. Maybe we didn't catch the swarm. How do we manage our colonies? Well, first and foremost, we want to monitor that hive for additional virgin queens or queen cells. Make sure they get back to that colony equilibrium. And it might have to be 2 or 3 weeks that you wait, but you have to let them get back to colony equilibrium. You may also need to split or remove excess queen cells to prevent those after swarms. So remember, I talked about how we get to equilibrium by queen on queen elimination or pre-emergence destruction. We could speed that process along. If we have 12 different queen cells and we're not going to make 12 splits, we could actually remove 10 of those queen cells and leave the 2 nicest ones so that it minimizes that risk of a secondary swarm. It doesn't mean that they won't swarm, but we can get them closer to equilibrium a lot faster by removing queen cells and helping them along. But we may also not understand or not know where we are in the equilibrium process. So I often get calls from beekeepers that say, hey, it's been 2 weeks. I still haven't seen a queen. I'm not seeing eggs. I need to buy a queen from you. And I always refer to this and tell them, do a frame test. And this is also why you have multiple colonies so that you're able to do the frame test. So, which is basically you take a frame of young open brood, so eggs and very young larvae from a colony that is queen, right? Make sure you don't take the queen along, keep her back in that colony, but you remove that frame, you put it in the colony that is suspected to be queenless, and you give it a week. After a week, you come back in and you look at that frame, and if you see queen cells that have developed, in this case, they would be emergency queen cells, that tells you that you have no queen, and at that point, you either need to let them requeen themselves, buy a new queen, combine them, whatever option you want to take, or if there are no queen cells and it's just normal brood development, that means that the queen is present and she's just not laying yet. So you have to give it more time to let that equilibrium take place. So again, here's that frame that you saw before, right? Lots of nectar coming in, lots of capped brood. And the closer you look, using some of the signs that you see within the colony, you could determine what's going on, just like I've been saying the entire talk. So this is one side of the frame. Well, when I turn that frame over, I see this, and there's all that nectar. And somebody, you might say, well, they're backfilling, right? They're filling all those cells with nectar. The reality of it is that they're actually removing nectar and making room for a queen to lay. And again, power of observation. If you look in this lower right-hand corner, there's a queen marked with a blue dot. And this is a case where I actually mark all my virgin queens, so I know if they come back or if there were multiple queens that I missed. In this case, she's mated, and they recognize that because her pheromone profile changed, and they're going to start moving that nectar out of the frame to give way to her. And if I looked at the next frame over, I see even more space being opened up for those bees. And then when I look at it closely, I could see the eggs in there. So she actually did start laying. So those types of things are very important when you're looking at colonies and determining what stage they're in. Now, as we kind of get to the closer end of the talk here, some of the things that we have to pay attention to when it comes to swarming is the influences that cause swarms to happen, not from a biology standpoint, but more from an environmental standpoint. So typically you're going to find warm, mostly sunny days, relatively calm, mid to late spring here in Pennsylvania, typically early May to late June. This year, we're about 3 weeks early with that. And also the time of day is very important. If you take anything away from this talk, is to pay attention to your colonies between the hours of 11 a.m. and 2 p.m. This is when most swarms are going to exit the hive. So if your colonies are in a location where you're able to go have lunch out there and kind of watch them do their thing, you might actually see them issue from the hive, or you might see the colony or the swarm hanging from a limb. So always between the hours of 11 and 2, maybe 10:30, maybe 2:30, but it never fails. Those hours, if I go into my bee yards, I'm going to see those swarms take off. Not to be confused with your orientation flights, as we talked about earlier, that occur later in the day, which is typically between 3 and 5. So obviously there's pros and cons to everything. And just like that, there's pros and cons to swarming. It's a natural break in the brood cycle. That's a good thing for mites. You might get a freshly mated, vigorously laying queen out of it. You might be able to increase the numbers of colonies or replicate that queen that you like because she produces a lot of honey, or maybe she's gentle. Swarms are great at producing lots of wax very quickly because they're typically made up of younger bees with very well-developed wax glands. And of course, it's an educational opportunity, right? Us to teach the non-beekeeping public what swarms are and how they happen. But of course, the negative aspects are you have a loss of field force, which can reduce your honey production. You have this delayed colony growth because you have to wait to get back to colony equilibrium. And of course, we always deal with those societal fears, especially in urban areas where you have to explain to the little old lady that these bees are not going to carry her chihuahua away up into the mountains and disappear, right? Bees are very gentle, especially when it comes to swarming behavior. Their stomachs are engorged with honey, and they're just looking for a place to go. So we have to engage and explain these things to the non-beekeeping public. I always joke that you can't have a beekeeping talk without talking about mites. So this is our mite slide for the night. Basically, this is a study done by Dr. Tom Seeley back in 2012 that shows a comparison of colonies that swarmed versus colonies that did not swarm. And ultimately what it shows is that those colonies that did swarm tend to have a lower mite drop or a mite population than those colonies that did not swarm. It's not a magic bullet, but it does help to know that the break in the brood cycle does help our bees a little bit when they swarm. So swarming is a very healthy thing for our colonies. So in summary, as we wrap the talk up here, we want to be proactive instead of reactive. We don't want to cut off those queen cells and then say, did I do the right thing? We want to stay ahead of those bees. Start early, be attentive, pay attention to what's going on to all aspects of the colony. Ask yourself the questions and analyze the consequences of the answers to those questions. What happens when I cut that swarm down while I'm looking up at it without a veil on? There's a consequence to that, so I have to put my veil on. What happens if you cut off your queen cells before you recognize if you have a queen or not? You might make yourself queenless without realizing it. And ultimately, don't limit yourself. You're going to make mistakes. The bees will typically fix those mistakes. You're going to kill bees. You're going to lose swarms. You're going to really mess up a colony. That's how you learn. It's not a bad thing. And ultimately, you have to remember, too, that time does not stand still in the bee yard, right? It's going to speed up, and you have to manage your bees. You can't say, I'll get to them next week. I'm going to go to the movies with my friends. You chose to keep bees, so you have to manage those bees. Beekeeping is an art and a science, right? The science is the knowledge. I can teach you that. The art is the application of that knowledge. How do you take what you learned tonight and apply it to the bee yard tomorrow? And of course, you cannot be a beekeeper without both. You really have to have an understanding of biology and management to do it successfully. Read your magazines, your scientific journals, your beekeeping books to gain that valuable information. Facebook is not one of these things. Now, obviously, the university pages, some of the bee clubs are great. But when you get onto some of these beekeeping pages, it's absurd, some of the answers that are out there. I always tell the story shortly after I wrote the book and it was published on swarming. Somebody had put a question about swarming and there were like 23 different answers. And of course, I added my 5 cents to it. And some other beekeeper jumped on there and said, "You're clearly a new beekeeper because you don't know much about swarming." Another beekeeper came back and said, he wrote the book. So, whatever. So you just never know what you're going to get on Facebook. I always get on there to raise my blood pressure and to have a few laughs, but that's kind of about it. So try to stay off of Facebook if you can help it. Of course, have fun with swarms. If you can't beat them, join them. Sometimes you just got to let bees be bees, let them do their thing and just sit back and watch, listen to them, smell the smell of the Nasonov gland, that lemongrass smell, watch their behavior as they land on their temporary resting spot and really pay attention to those the behaviors. It's going to make you a better beekeeper in the long run. I add these last couple slides because people always ask, well, how do I trap swarms? What's the best way to set up bee traps? And this is a setup that Dr. Seeley has written about. His ideal setup is a box that's about 40 liters in size, a 2.5-inch square opening, 10 to 15 feet high in a south shaded area. Shape doesn't necessarily matter and color doesn't necessarily matter. And he's published this and has spoken about it. And what I'll tell you is to forget all about that and do it my way. This is how I set up. And of course, I say that tongue in cheek. I've joked with Dr. Seeley about it. He wrote the foreword to my book. So I always rib him about how his ideal setup is not really ideal in my neck of the woods. But what I use is an 8-frame deep. And for comparison, a 10-frame deep is 43 liters, 8-frame is 35. Dr. Seeley says 40 is ideal. So we're kind of on both ends there. I use a 1.5-inch opening. I use a migratory top and a solid bottom, mainly because my swarm traps are strictly swarm traps. I don't use them for anything else other than trapping bees, and then they go right back up again. My first 6 frames are undrawn. I use 8-frame deeps, as I mentioned, because it's easy. The first 6 frames are undrawn foundation. I use 1 frame of drawn brood in the 7th slot. My 8th is undrawn foundation, and that is buying me time. So if I don't get to my trap and I've caught bees, all they're doing is drawing out comb for me, and it's easier to transfer. I put them up about 6 to 8 feet high because that's as high as I can reach. I don't want to deal with my ladders. I use Swarm Commander as a lure. A lot of people will say, well, lemongrass is cheaper and it works just as well. I will tell you, and this is not a paid advertisement, Swarm Commander will outcatch lemongrass 100 to 1. Swarm Commander mimics the Nasonov gland, and the Nasonov gland is that come hither pheromone that the bees put out when they're saying, hey, here we are. The Nasonov odor is comprised of 7 different chemical components. Swarm Commander mimics all 7 of those components. Lemongrass is just one of those components. So you're taking a single chemical component versus 7, which is why Swarm Commander works so well. But I put them facing south, well shaded to keep the heat off of them. And I paint mine for concealment purposes just to keep them out of sight, out of mind. And this is basically what it looks like. There's lots of different designs out there. They all work. This was what works for me. I like it. So I always tell people about it because they ask. So obviously, shameless advertising, Swarm Essentials. This book is available on wickwas.com. It's also available through a number of your bee supply companies. I believe Daydant has it and Better Bee. I usually sell them on my website, but I was just in Maryland a few weeks ago and I sold an entire case of books and I haven't had a new case shipped to me yet. So I apologize that I don't have them on my website, but wickwas.com is Larry Connor's website. He's my publisher. He has them there on site. And so with that, I will wrap up the talk and come up for air and take a drink, but I'll leave you with 2 things. One is this quote, which I really, really like. that states the biggest communication problem is that we listen to reply and not to understand. And I think that's very true of society and beekeepers on Facebook, that we just want to reply and be the know-it-all rather than understand what the other person is saying. And lastly, I get a lot of questions about this picture and how great it is. And everybody wants to know what I'm holding up in the air. And it's just simply a copy of my book. So make sure you reach out and get a copy of my book. And hopefully we'll be able to see each other in person one day, and I'll be happy to sign them. It'll devalue it 100%. So you can give it away, use it as smoker fuel, whatever you want. It's vegetable ink, recycled paper. It works on a number of levels. So with that, I appreciate your time and your attention, and I'll stop the share and answer any questions you guys have. I have plenty of time before daylight, so we're good to go on our end.
This is so great. Can you hear me okay?
I can, yes.
Okay, perfect. So we have a wireless mic,
Okay.
which I'm hoping will work okay. So what I'm going to do is whoever has a question first, I'm going to bring the mic to you, and then I'll have you guys just pass it around if that's okay. So who has a question? So your minds are probably just blowing up right now. You're absorbing and digesting. Does anybody have a question? We'll just start. Anybody? Oh, come on, you guys. Okay, think of something.
This is
Okay, here we go.
case.
Here we go. Here we go. Let's go over here. All right. Okay, I'm going to hand this to you. All right. There you go.
The negative effects of nosema on a queen coming out of the winter.
Mhm.
Well, I was wondering about it. Cuts down on the brood, laying eggs.
It can. So the only thing I will mention though is that, so you're referring to Nosema apis, which is the classic Nosema that's found in overwintering colonies. And recently, probably within the last 5 years, what we're finding is that there's much less Nosema apis around and more Nosema ceranae. Nosema ceranae doesn't really have symptoms other than we can only identify under a microscope. And they found that Nosema ceranae is the one that affects more egg laying and wintering survival than apis. So apis is pretty much non-existent. We've sent samples after samples to the bee labs, and really it doesn't exist. And the one thing we are finding is that you are seeing some confusion over the signs of what used to be Nosema apis versus signs of what is dysentery, right? So dysentery is a symptom of apis, but it's also a symptom of feeding honey that's high in ash content or feeding solid foods. But ultimately, yeah, I mean, to back around to your question, Nosema can influence queen production. But what we're also finding is there's a lot more strains of bees out there that are tolerating very high levels of Nosema ceranae. So it's not too much of an effect, and most beekeepers aren't worrying about it at this point.
Okay. Great deal. Oh, another question? Anyone else? Back there? No? Well,
Come on, don't be shy.
All right, here we go. All right, there you go. Got it? Okay.
Hello, Stephen. My question is, once you catch a swarm in a swarm catch box, do you leave them alone, or is there a length of time before you'll make your first inspection?
Yeah, that's a good question. Answer is yes. It all depends. So if I physically see a swarm move in, like I happen to, there's a cluster and you can see they're moving in. Generally, what I'll do is I'll peek in there that evening, make sure there's a large amount of bees, and I will move them immediately. If I get in there and I see there's a lot of bees, but I'm not sure when I captured them and I don't see eggs or larvae yet, I'll typically leave them in place until I see eggs and larvae, because what happens is when a colony moves in, if it's a virgin queen, she could take multiple orientation flights and multiple mating flights. And if I move that box in the process of her flight, meaning she flew today, I move it at night, and then she goes to fly tomorrow, I've completely changed her orientation, which could ultimately end up her being lost, so to speak, because she's used to, even though they reset their GPSs and they'll orient, I've noticed I lose more queens if I move them in that whole mating process. So ultimately my schedule results in most of those bees staying there for several days to several weeks before I move them. So it's not an issue for me, but a lot of people will say, well, if you see a colony move in, you have to wait until you have pollen coming in before you move them. And the reality is it's kind of a case by case basis. So if it's a trap in your backyard and you watch the swarm show up and they moved in, you could go ahead and move them that night to your yard and replace the trap the next day. And oftentimes you'll catch a second swarm because it's just all the odor that's there. But ultimately, if I need to, I kind of wait until I see eggs. So I know the queen is mated and then I'll take it away. But it can vary widely.
Good deal. All right. Anyone else? No. Let's check anybody in the chat. No. How about any of our folks that are on Zoom? Do you want to go ahead and unmute yourself for a second and ask a question? Anybody there?
So either everybody's confused or everybody knows about swarming and we wasted our time tonight.
Oh, here we go. Judy has a question. All right. There we go.
Thanks. This is great talk.
Thank you.
When you talk about this very short time period during the queen rearing, how many days old the queen cell is and so
Yep.
forth, it sounds like you're looking into the hive pretty much every day. Is that
Yeah,
kinda
that's a good point. That's a good point. Yeah. So I don't, because, and this is do as I say, not as I do type of thing, but I run a lot of single brood chambers and I have it tuned to the point where as soon as I put supers on in the spring and I get everybody ready, my single brood chamber management, I have a very low swarming rate because I'm staying ahead of the bees constantly. I mark my queens. So when I put my supers on in late March, and then pull them off in early July, when I pull them off, I go back through those colonies and 90% of my queens are still in there marked. So I'm not saying I don't not have swarms, but generally with a single brood chamber system, I'm doing very well at minimizing swarming. But to get to your point, yeah, you have a very short window. So you don't have to go in every day, but what I will tell you is that you really have to look at your management in that prevention aspect of it, because a good friend of mine went in every 5 days to 4 different colonies, and every 5 days he went in, and from the start of swarm season until I think it was sometime like late July, and he was removing queen cells every 5 days. They were trying to swarm. He finally got through to the point where he said, okay, I think we're past swarm impulse. And they swarmed a couple of weeks later. So it shows you how driven those bees can be if they don't have the right resources available to them. So the answer to your question is you don't have to go in every day, but you also, I often see the comment of, I went in, I saw queen cells, so I removed them. I'll go back in 2 weeks and I'll check again. And 2 weeks is too late. They're long gone. So my point is that at least understand that active swarming window is very short. So you just have to take that knowledge and apply it to your management. And whether it's going in your colony every day, whether it's understanding that, okay, when I start to see queen cells, I can't just cut queen cells out and forget about it. If I cut queen cells out, that gives me 5 more days or 6 more days to come up with a plan, whether it's finding the queen and making a split, whether it's adding a lot more supers and checkerboarding. Like there's 1,001 things that we can do. It's more of taking that knowledge and utilizing it to create a management plan for your own bees.
Mhm.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It does. Here we go. Okay, good job.
Okay, when you catch a swarm and you got it in your bucket or your box or whatever, do you leave it in there for like overnight? Can you do that? Or do you go and you dump it into a brood box?
Yeah.
And then do you lock them in there for a couple days or just let them roam free and do what they're going to do?
Yep. Good questions. So in my world, if I can get that swarm captured and put into a box immediately or fast, that's better for me because I'm very, very busy. I own a pest control company as well that deals with strictly with stinging insects. So we're running nuts as it is. So if I capture a swarm, I want it in and out of my truck as fast as possible. And the thing with swarming is when they swarm, they reset their GPSs. So as soon as you catch that swarm, even if it's in your own yard, you can catch that swarm and it was 20 feet from the colony it came from. You could take that swarm, put it into a brood box right next to the colony it came from, and you'll be perfectly fine because their GPS is reset and they don't know that they actually came from next door. So there are times I'll catch a swarm and I'll run them to one of my yards and dump them right away. There's times that I'll catch swarms towards the end of the day and I'll box them up and just keep them in the box overnight until I can get them into a brood box. My main goal is to get them into a brood box as soon as possible, whenever that may be. Once I do that, I don't lock them up. There's no need to lock them up. That came from the idea that beekeepers have tossed bees in a box and they come back and they absconded, right? The bees are gone. I've had that happen after I've locked them up for a day. I've locked them up for 2 days. I've not locked them up. I have bees abscond. It's typically colonies or swarms that have virgin queens that abscond rather than colonies that have mated queens. And I don't know why that is. They just are dead set on not being in a box that you give to them, and they're gonna abscond regardless. So ultimately, I try to put them into a brood box as soon as possible. I let them free fly. If you really want to anchor a swarm, and the idea behind locking them up is that if you lock them up, the queen is going to start to lay if she's mated, or the bees will start to draw wax and that'll anchor them. And that doesn't necessarily anchor them. What will anchor them, if you could do this, is take a frame of open brood from a different colony, shake the bees off of that open brood and stick that in with a swarm, and the pheromone from that open brood will cause that swarm to anchor, and they will stay there 100% every single time. So I'm not a fan of locking them in. I am a fan of getting them into a brood box as soon as possible, whenever that may be.
Hi, Stephen.
Howdy.
Great presentation.
Thank you.
I have a wild caught box of nasty bees.
Okay.
Should I allow them to swarm, or should I do a split with them, or what should I do?
So wild caught, did they come from a tree, or you're just saying that they just came from somewhere, but you're not sure where the colony is?
Well, the guy that I got them from, he said that they just came into his empty hive and they stayed.
So we don't know if they're technically feral, or they could come from your neighbor three miles away, right? We don't know that part. But the more important thing is that they're nasty. So what I would do, we want to be good managers, right? We want to be good stewards, and that means not allowing pissy ass bees to get into the environment. Pardon my French. So a lot of times, what I do is, if I get a colony that's that mean, I either put them next to a neighbor that I don't like, or I'll put them into a yard that is fairly remote. If I don't have either one of those, you could sell them to a new beekeeper. I'm kidding. Ultimately, what I would do, though, if you do have that they're mean, I would probably requeen. So I would get in there and pinch the queen, kill her, and then install a queen of known gentle genetics. And then, of course, it's going to take about 6 weeks before that turnover, because you have to have the old mean bees die off before the new gentler bees take over. But yeah, if they're that mean and they're not somewhere where you could just kind of stick them in a corner and set it and forget it, which I've done. Mean bees make lots of honey and they don't get varroa mites as bad. They're great survivors, but they're not meant to be let loose into the environment to swarm over and over again, unless you have lots of space to do that. So I would recommend, as a good beekeeper, just to requeen that and get rid of those nasty genetics, whatever they may be.
Okay, I just did a walk away with them, and trying to do that, I could not find the queen.
Yep.
Because they were so nasty, they were stinging through my suit.
Yep. So one way to deal with that is to make multiple nukes with them, right? So just make a lot of 2-frame nukes and split them all up. And then you only have two, and the less bees they have, the less pissy they get. So that's a good way to, it's a little bit rough, but you have to use smoke and get through it. And I've been there, but if you have 20 frames, make up 10 nukes, 10 2-frame nukes, get a bunch of cheap nuke boxes and put 2 frames in each box, and then come back and start to look, and you'll find that they're a lot gentler because there's no safety in numbers, and it's going to be a lot easier to find the queen. There's other ways to find the queen, but with a mean colony, you don't want to do it. Like shake all the bees out through a queen excluder. And of course, with mean bees, that's a good way to get stung. But yeah, if you could break them up even into smaller nukes, that'll give you a chance to find the queen, and then get rid of her. And then you could recombine them and requeen the entire colony.
Yeah, they attack people that are 20, 30 feet away when I'm in there.
Yeah, the other option is close them up at night and let them meet a bottle of Dawn dish detergent. Yeah,
All
mean
right.
mean bees are tough. I mean, I know we don't like to kill bees, but there's some bees that just don't deserve to be doing what they do.
Oh, you got it. You have a question too, or no? Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Here we go.
So not on your swarm management, but you touched on the fact that you also do stinging insect control as a
Yep.
business.
Yep.
We are currently looking into finding pest control for the property. Are there key things that I should ask or be aware of when finding someone who does that, but doing it on the property where I'm trying to raise bees?
So you're looking for a pest control company to do some type of treatment
Hornets. We've
on your
got
property.
lots of wasps, and I would love to be able to manage them easier, but I'm afraid of hurting the colonies.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for asking that. So one thing that you want to ask is, one, what type of chemicals they're going to use. And that's always good to know. And ultimately, you will find out that the chemicals that they use are going to be labeled for killing stinging insects, right? More importantly is to understand how they're applying it. So I've, when we treat, we're watching the wind direction. We're watching overspray, things along those lines. So how high or how close to your house are your hives?
Oh, there you go.
200 feet.
So they're close, but not that close. So couple of things to understand about the chemicals is that a lot of them, if I sprayed them on my bees directly, it would certainly kill them. But when you treat a structure, whether it's your house or garage or whatever it is that you're going to treat to minimize wasps, the application, depending on what they do, is usually a liquid application, so that when it dries, it leaves behind a very tiny microcrystal, and it would only impact insects that land and traverse across that barrier. So on structures, there's usually not a situation where your bees are going to be attracted to your house unless they are trying to move in as a swarm, right? So 99% of the time, any type of treatment that they do to your structure is not going to be an issue. Certainly, they want to watch wind drift. So if the wind is blowing towards your hives and they're spraying, that mist could have an impact. So you want to talk to them about that. But generally speaking, other than that, there's nothing you need to worry about unless a swarm leaves your colony and decides to move into your house, in which case they'll probably come in contact and die. But do you really want a swarm of bees in your house? I mean, if you do, then that's a whole different story. But most people don't want colonies of bees living in their house. So in a nutshell, nothing to worry about. Just ask them what chemicals he's using, ask them how they're going to apply it, and just notify them that, hey, there's bees on my property. Let's watch the wind drift so it's not affected. We've done that here with, I do it with my company, but even we have, you guys probably don't have spotted lanternflies yet. You've probably heard about them here in the East. It's the newest invasive species. At our Pittsburgh International Airport, we had a large population of lanternflies, and they wanted to come in and spray, and I've got bees everywhere. So we were really strict about, we knew what chemical they were using. It's a chemical I was familiar with, but we were very strict on what days they could spray based on the wind direction and how they sprayed and how they applied it, and they had to do some special things. But a good company is going to work with you on that, and most of them will work with you in saying, okay, you've got bees, we'll figure out how to do it with a certain direction and all that good stuff. But yeah, it's good that you're asking those questions. Those are great questions.
That's so good. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Marie. All right. Anybody else? Do we have, and this is just anybody else that's on Zoom? Do you have any questions? Any raise of hands? I think we're all good.
Yeah, I don't see any,
Right.
any questions. Yeah.
Okay. Well, very good. Well, we've already posted the link on how to get Stephen's book on the Facebook group, but we will share that in our emails as well. And with that, if there's no other questions.
I have a question. I want to know how
okay.
good I want to know how good the Mexican food was.
Oh, it was great.
Was it?
It was really good.
I'm hungry for Mexican.
This is a good spot. It's hard to find good Mexican food in other places, we've found out.
Yeah. Huh.
Yeah. There's certain parts of the country. So
Yeah.
we are so thankful to have you, and thank you so much for being a speaker for us. And just everybody, what we'll do is just a quick reminder. So our next month's meeting for May may just be Zoom only. We're going to have Dr. I think here I am so bad with pronouncing last names. Dr. Kolonek, I think from Washington State University. She's going to be talking to us about her studies on the varroa mite and robbing and like mite bombs. So that's going to be pretty interesting. We might also have a field trip that we're going to plan for May, if we can, to it's a members only field trip to John Foster's property. He runs a 30,000 hive commercial operation, and last year he gave us a tour and they wanted to let us come back. So we're going to try and plan that for May. And then really exciting news for June, our June meeting, which is June 8th, we're actually going to have Randy Oliver, and he's actually going to come here live in person for that meeting. He's up in Grass Valley. We're super lucky to have him so close, but he's actually going to make the drive. So we're thrilled. So with that, Stephen, thank you so much again. We're so grateful to
Thank
have
you.
you, and you stayed up late, and hopefully you can go get some food, and we're gonna and we're gonna let you go so you can eat and get to bed, and then we're gonna do our raffle and do that. So sound
Very
good?
good. Thank you very
Thank
much,
you so
everybody. You
much.
guys have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Bye
You too. All right. Let me stop the recording.